Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back, and today we're going to be looking at another Epic History TV video on the Napoleon series. This one is a bit of a fill-in actually, so I think they just released this a couple months ago. It is the Battle of Eylau, 1807. So what is happening at this point for Napoleon? So he is fighting against the Fourth Coalition, made up of Prussia, Russia, Britain, Austria, and Sweden, all the familiar friends, and he's trying to basically establish dominance over Europe at this point. So just before this event, we had the 1806 video in which France defeated the Prussians at the Battle of Jena. So all of Prussia is basically very quickly controlled by Napoleon, and now he's going to be fighting the Russians at a pretty decisive battle at the Battle of Eylau, but it might not go as well as you think. So let's have a look at this one for Epic History TV to fill us in on what happened here at the Battle of Eylau, 1807. If you haven't already yet, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Let's get into it.
January 1807. French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, victor of Ulm, Austerlitz and Jena, was near the height of his powers. His Grande Armée had swept all before it. Now, in the depths of a bitter Polish winter, he sought the final victory that would make him master of Europe. His target, the Russians, supported by the remains of the Prussian army.
Yeah. And so in 1806, Napoleon admits a crushing defeat on the Prussians and basically breaks Prussia as it is. As you can see here, they're just in Danzig, modernly Gdansk, and Königsberg, modernly Kaliningrad. And it's just a couple of divisions here, right? There's just 3 divisions or battalions. And again, we've not seen that name for a while, have we? But we'll see how this plays out.
But many months of campaigning had exhausted even his toughest veterans. Most had not seen France in years, and the war in Poland seemed to offer only freezing mud, hunger, and a stubborn enemy who did not know when he was beaten.
Nope.
At Pultusk, the Russians had fought courageously and thwarted Napoleon's first attempt to outmaneuver their army. But another opportunity would soon emerge. Command of the Russian army had recently passed to General Levin August von Bennigsen. Despite his German name and Hanoverian roots, he was a veteran of 34 years' service with the Imperial Russian Army.
Just a thought I had here. How many royals came from Hanover? I mean, I think, and I might get this completely wrong, it's not my area that I really look a lot into, but isn't the English royal family of King George of Hanover? No? I actually wonder how much of a role Hanover has played in sort of monasteries, in monarchies and dynasties and stuff like this too. I have this feeling that a lot of royals came from Hanover at this point. I mean, obviously they're all marrying each other, right? The most famous one is, the World War I basically being the War of the Cousins, right? With Kaiser Wilhelm being the cousin of Tsar Nicholas, as well as King George, right? King George of Hanover. They were all cousins. So maybe Hanover has played a larger role in history than one might think.
On the 27th of January, with 77,000 Russians and 13,000 Prussians, Bennigsen launched a surprise winter offensive, targeting Marshal Ney's exposed 6th Corps. But Ney escaped, and Bernadotte's 1st Corps fought a successful rearguard action at Moringen. Now Napoleon would turn the tables on Bennigsen. As soon as he'd learned of the Russian advance, he'd begun planning a grand encirclement of the enemy.
Here we go.
Suddenly, it was the Russians who were exposed. But Bennigsen got wind of Napoleon's trap just in time and began a hurried withdrawal. 5 days of relentless marching followed, with Marshal Murat's vanguard nipping at the Russians' heels all the way.
Just look at the scale.
Despite a series of furious assaults on their rearguard, ably commanded by Prince Bagration, the French could not break through. The pursuit continued, even as temperatures plummeted. To the north, Ney shadowed Lestocq's Prussian corps, while Soult's 4th Corps followed the Russian rearguard to the small East Prussian town of Eylau.
And here we go. I mean, even just this small painting, right? I mean, look at just the pure bloody size of this. All the ranks forming in the town that's just completely destroyed, right? As you said, a small town too. So, you know, you're probably looking at everything that Eylau had to offer here. And, I mean, look at these numbers. So there's over 100,000 men here that are going to fight. And there's going to be a lot of casualties as well in just this one small little town.
On the afternoon of the 7th of February, Marshal Soult's troops advanced up the icy road to Eylau. They found it held by General Barclay de Tolly's Russian division, entrenched along a line of fences, ditches, and barricades. Just before dusk, confused combat began around the town's cemetery. More and more troops were sucked into the bitter fighting. The French took the cemetery with a bayonet charge, but then had to hold it against a determined Russian counterattack, led by Barclay himself, who was seriously wounded by grape shot.
There's something about troops fighting on a cemetery. There's just some sort of message, some sort of thing there that's going on where you have people dying on top of dead people, some of them who might have even fallen quite recently in the Battle of Jena, right? You know, some small town man who goes and volunteers and fights for the Prussian army, or God knows what. Maybe even he was buried here, and then just a few months later for then Russian troops and French troops to be fighting over the graves of civilians and possibly soldiers and everything. That's just, there's something, you know, you kind of feel that. I don't know how to describe it, but that's something.
Vicious street fighting continued well into
death on death
to the night, but the French ultimately prevailed, with the loss of 4,000 casualties on each side.
Yikes. Isn't it a little ironic too that this town over here is named Freiheit, right? Which means freedom. That's yeah.
Soldiers and officers alike were astonished by the savagery of the engagement.
I can only imagine.
As darkness fell, temperatures dropped dramatically. Many of the wounded froze to death where they had fallen. The French ransacked Eylau for food and firewood. Many Russian soldiers had to sleep in open fields, wrapped only in their greatcoats, forbidden to light fires. That night, Napoleon's greatest concern was that the Russians would slip away under cover of darkness, robbing him of the decisive battle he craved. He need not have worried. Bennigsen was done running. Here, at Eylau, the Russians would make their stand. Is something interfering with your happiness? Or preventing you from achieving your goals?
No.
If so, therapy can be a valuable tool in helping you to live a happier, more fulfilled life. This is an advert for BetterHelp, who are making therapy more accessible for millions of everyday people. There's a link in our video description.
Man, you got on the BetterHelp train, eh? If you're curious, if you care at all, just look up about this company. There's been some very interesting YouTube videos that I've watched on it. I hope they got a very fat paycheck from this. I hope they got a very fat paycheck for being sponsored by BetterHelp. I get the games and, you know, the World War II games and you know, stuff like that and whatever, but BetterHelp, man, I mean, ooh, yikes. Okay, let's move past that one. Vast hurricane of death. Something we'd hope to never experience.
Before dawn, Napoleon was on Eylau's cemetery knoll, trying to make out the Russian lines through his telescope. He was surprised by what he saw. 67,000 Russians packed into two great lines along a 3-mile front, with well-defended villages anchoring both flanks. Open ground lay between the two armies, providing a clear field of fire for Bennigsen's 400 guns, a huge amount of artillery for an army of the age. Napoleon had Soult and Augereau's depleted corps, plus the Imperial Guard and Murat's reserve cavalry, just 45,000 men and 137 guns. But Napoleon was expecting Davout's Third Corps, 15,000 men, to arrive at any moment, in perfect position to fall on the Russian flank. At dawn, as French troops were still getting into position, hundreds of Russian guns opened a massive bombardment. In Eylau, there was chaos, as round shot crashed through buildings and tore through men. French guns soon answered the Russians in kind. It was the largest combined artillery bombardment the world had yet seen.
Wow.
It lasted nearly 3 hours. While Bennigsen had quantity, French crews were more experienced, and against the densely packed Russian lines, they couldn't miss.
Shred right through. And that's the worst part too, is that because these men are staying in these tight formations, right, and staying in these lines, a cannonball at this point just rips right through them, just tearing and just, you know, it's not like in modern days, right, where you have these very small bullets and everything that leave, you know, small piercing holes and will go right through you. This is just gnawing at limbs, right, just cracking and breaking, and it's just, oh, it's just awful. It's awful. If you ever, I'm going to forget the name of the channel now, of course, but they talk about basically medical surgery and stuff like this, and they did an episode on medical surgery during the Napoleonic Wars. Just be happy we live in 2024. That's all I'll say.
Meanwhile, Davout's two leading divisions arrived on the battlefield, dangerously placed on the Russian left flank. But before they could attack, Prince Golitsyn struck first with his cavalry brigade. Davout's veterans threw back the horsemen with disciplined fire. Golitsyn's charge, however, bought time for General Bagavout to reorganize his defensive line to face the new threat. When the Iron Marshal attacked around 8 AM, he found the enemy entrenched on a ridge with formidable artillery support. Davout's lead division was mauled, suffering 1,500 casualties as it was thrown back. This check on Davout alarmed Napoleon. He feared the Russians might withdraw before his trap could close. It was, he decided, the battle's critical moment. Orders flew out to Marshal Augereau's 7th Corps and General Saint-Hilaire's division. They were to launch a frontal attack against the enemy. At all costs, the Russians' escape must be prevented.
And it's important to note here that at 1807, the Grande Armée is practically bloody invincible, right? Napoleon has not suffered any of the major, he has suffered small defeats, but none of the major defeats that we would see in the coming years, right? Even the propaganda value alone of this, of the Grande Armée basically being invincible and just shredding through all of Europe at this point, and Napoleon's tactical brilliance here, that in and of itself, that sort of, what would you say, that sort of perception, the cracks start coming through, as you'll see. And a lot of this is obviously being by Napoleon seeking for that decisive victory, for that decisive step in here, which all the previous major battles before, he got it, and he won. And we'll see here what the result of that is in this case.
The 49-year-old Marshal Augereau had been with Napoleon since his first command in Italy and the brilliant campaign of '96. But he was deeply unwell that morning. At 10 a.m., strapped to his horse, he led forward the 12,000 troops of 7th Corps, just as heavy snow began to fall. With visibility down to a few feet, Augereau's divisions drifted off course, straight into the murderous artillery duel. French and Russian cannonballs tore through their ranks. Augereau's men pushed on doggedly, but as they neared the Russian line, the blizzard suddenly lifted. One division found itself facing 70 Russian guns at a range of just 30 yards. Seconds later, its forward ranks were obliterated by Russian canister. Another French division broke through the enemy line, only to be surrounded on 3 sides by Russian bayonets and annihilated. Augereau's horse was killed under him, leaving him badly injured. As the survivors of his corps stumbled back the way they'd come, Russian cavalry and infantry surged forward. Units were overrun, entire regiments swallowed up. Order and discipline collapsed.
Chaos.
One of the few units to maintain order was the 14th Infantry, nicknamed the Brave for its heroic role at Rivoli 10 years before.
Look, I gotta be honest, I think you should be naming every single regiment here, considering what they just faced. The Brave as well, but
now they were outnumbered and surrounded. The regiment resisted bravely, but was cut to pieces, suffering 75% casualties and the loss of its Eagle standard. In the space of just 30 minutes, the Russians inflicted 5,000 casualties on Augereau's 7th Corps.
One more time. In 30 minutes, 30 minutes, they inflicted 5,000 casualties. Those are not numbers that we would hear until 110 years later, right, in the First World War, or even in the Second World War as well. 30 minutes, 5,000 casualties. Not the bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars. That's a video in and of itself that I've already done. But still, 5,000 lives cut short. 5,000 stories ended. I know casualty also means wounded. I know. But nonetheless, in 30 minutes.
Effectively, it had ceased to exist. It was one of the worst battlefield disasters of the Napoleonic Wars.
Yep.
For the French, Eylau was no longer a fight for victory, but a struggle for survival.
Just gonna say that. You know, fellows, not the worst word he could have used.
From Eylau's cemetery knoll, Napoleon watched the catastrophe engulfing Augereau's corps. He knew he must stabilize the situation immediately and buy time to reorganize his center and for Davout's corps to arrive in force. So the Emperor turned to Murat and his large cavalry reserve. It was a desperate gamble. The horses were tired and suffering from the cold. They'd be outnumbered and unsupported by infantry. But the flamboyant, apparently fearless Marshal Murat was undaunted.
Possibly insane.
He assembled 40 squadrons of cavalry, 5,000 dragoons and cuirassiers, and led them forward. So began one of the legendary cavalry charges of the Napoleonic Wars. Unable to move much faster than a walk due to the terrible conditions, Murat's cavalry nevertheless presented a formidable wall of men, horses and steel. General Grouchy's dragoons, in the lead, drove back the advancing Russians. Dirtpool's steel-clad cuirassiers then thundered forward on their giant horses. Finding a gap between two Russian divisions, they used it to pry open the enemy line. With seemingly unstoppable momentum, the riders surged forward. But it could not last. As they neared Bennigsen's headquarters, a Russian battery blasted the French horsemen with canister. Dirtpool himself was mortally wounded. French momentum was lost. As the Russian counterattack began, Murat ordered his squadrons to regroup and pull back. He almost didn't make it. The Russian 4th Division had moved to block his escape. Seeing this, Napoleon ordered Marshal Bessières to lead forward the Guard cavalry. These were 2,000 of the finest cavalry in Europe.
Yep.
And to cheers of "Vive l'Empereur," they advanced into the whirling mass of shot and snow.
You have to call on your best guys to break this out, right? It's all about depth.
When Colonel Lepic saw his men ducking, he called out, "Heads up, by God! Those are bullets, not turds."
Okay.
Chasseurs of the Guard charged down the first Russian infantry square they met, scattered the enemy's gunners, and cut out a path for Murat's retreating squadrons.
Crazy.
The French charge at Eylau would go down as one of the boldest, most desperate military maneuvers of the age. The losses were terrible in men and horses, but it succeeded in its mission. The Russian advance had been stopped in its tracks, and the initiative had swung back to Napoleon.
And you can only imagine too, right? If the encirclement had have actually worked and Murat was killed or captured or hadn't made it out of there in any sort of way, what that might have changed, right? Napoleon loses one of his best marshals first off, right? One of his best generals. And then all those troops that are then annihilated are unable to be saved. Would Friedland have looked different, right? Would that have actually changed something just a few months later afterwards without those few thousand troops? Without Murat? Who knows?
Marshal Davout's 3rd Corps, the famed heroes of Auerstedt 4 months before, had now arrived in sufficient force to launch a full-scale assault. Anticipating this, Bagavout withdrew to a new defensive line on the Kriegerberge, a dominating height perfect for artillery. 2 hours of chaotic fighting followed, with every French advance challenged by a fierce Russian counterattack. But supported by dragoons and Saint-Hilaire's division, 3rd Corps slowly ground down the enemy. Bennigsen was forced to send in his last reserve, Kaminsky's 14th Division. Supported by cavalry, it drove the French from Klein-Sausgarten and across the fields beyond until its own advance was checked by French artillery. When Davout resumed his attack at 3 p.m, the Russian line buckled. The Kriegerberge was taken. So too Bennigsen's headquarters at Auklappen. Bennigsen scraped together enough units to improvise a new defensive line, but French guns, hauled up to the Kriegerberge, opened up a devastating fire.
Sorry, I can't. That just sounds like that sounds like the secret menu at Burger King, the Kriegerburger. Kriegerburger, but anyways, whatever.
The French pressure was irresistible. The Russian flank would surely collapse at any moment, handing Napoleon the decisive victory he so desperately sought. All that was required was one final push.
He's gonna do it again. Is he? He'll do it again. Come on. And not pushovers at this point either, right? Prussians are still fierce
Early that
fighters.
morning, Bennigsen had sent urgent orders to Prussian General Anton von Lestock to join the main army with his corps as quickly as possible. Although nearly 70, Lestock was still as energetic as he'd been serving under Frederick the Great, and was assisted by a highly capable chief of staff, Colonel Gerhard von Scharnhorst.
I'm gonna say, it bloody well looks like Frederick the Great here.
Lestock's corps, 9,000 men, was 8 miles northwest of Eylau, closely watched by Marshal Ney's 6th Corps. His orders were to prevent the Prussians linking up with the Russians at all costs. But by force-marching his troops along frozen, hilly country roads, Lestock was able to bypass Ney's blocking force. To Bennigsen's joy, by early afternoon, the Prussians had reached Schmödeten. With his left flank crumbling, there was no time to lose. At 4 p.m, Lestock's Prussians charged forward. By now, Davout's men had been marching and fighting for many hours, and were utterly spent. They managed a few ragged volleys, before they turned and ran.
Yep.
Russian cavalry followed in pursuit. Marshal Davout, with just one intact division left, prepared to make a stand on the Kriegerberge. "The brave," he shouted, "will find a glorious death here." Fortunately for Davout, the enemy's attacks were poorly coordinated, and his 40-gun battery inflicted terrible losses. Around 5:30, as dusk fell, Ney's corps arrived in pursuit of the Prussians and took Schlödeten. This new threat forced Bennigsen to call off his attack on Davout. And as darkness descended, the day's slaughter finally came to an end.
And terrible losses, terrible losses were absolutely inflicted, and a morale victory here too for the Russians, honestly.
Since Napoleon had crowned himself emperor in 1804, every campaign, every battle he'd waged, had ended in brilliant success. No longer. Bennigsen, learning the true scale of his army's losses and its critical shortage of ammunition, withdrew overnight. The French were left holding a frozen, corpse-strewn battlefield, allowing Napoleon to claim a victory. But in reality, Eylau had been a murderous slaughter, without a winner. As Marshal Ney exclaimed on seeing the battlefield, "What a massacre!" and without result.
For the French, but as I said before, this is a massive victory for the Russians. Although they obviously didn't push them back, and they weren't able to take, well, they weren't able to push them out of Eylau. The propaganda victory that this is as well, right? And the fact that it's that the first crack in the Grande Armée and the first time that they're truly defeated in a way and took heavy casualties for seemingly nothing. The army was not destroyed, it was not encircled, there was not any key players that were killed or anything like this. All this progress would obviously be put in Napoleon's favor in Friedland, which would be another brilliant victory, but this is still an important one. It's the first crack to the eventual end of the Grande Armée.
Exact casualty figures are unknown due to the chaos and conditions of the battle and the scale of loss.
Tens of thousands.
It is likely that the Russians lost 20,000 men, killed, wounded or captured. The French, perhaps as many as 25,000. What is clear is that thousands of French veterans, the victors of Ulm, Austerlitz and Jena, met their end on the snowy fields of East Prussia. Napoleon's Grande Armée would go on to achieve many more great victories, including a crushing victory over Bennigsen's Russians at Friedland 4 months later. But after the brutal losses of Eylau, it was never the same.
Yeah. Exactly. So,
thank you to the artists Keith Rocco and Alexander
I mean, the paintings are brilliant. I absolutely love the paintings here. Anyways, thank you very much for watching on this one. The first crack in the Grande Armée, as I said, Battle of Eylau, 1807. And I'll take a little bit of a break from Napoleon videos here. I think I've done 3 in a row, and I'll get to some other stuff. So please let me know in the comment section down below what you would like me to check out. Even if it's other Napoleon videos, but not Epic History TV ones, that's cool with me too. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. See you in the next one.